think people are coming through now. Okay, thank you everyone for joining this webinar on building gender inclusive workplaces, the role of hybrid and flexible working. Rosie, do you mind moving on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So my name is Lucky Singh and I'm the Client Relationship Manager here at King's Business School, and I work within the Executive Education Department. Joining me today are my two colleagues, Professor Rosie Campbell and Dr. Maddie Wyatt. I'm going to hand over to them both to introduce themselves properly.
Hello, I'm Rosie Campbell. I'm the Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College. Over to you, Maddie.
I'm Maddie. I'm a Reader in Diversity and Inclusion and Associate Dean of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Business School at King's.
Great, thanks so much. So the agenda for today's session is that I'm going to be handing over to Rosie very shortly to take us through the Global Institute for Women's Leadership's Flexible Working Report, and she'll be sharing the kind of interesting bits and the findings from that report. Rosie and Maddie will then be having a discussion based upon that, and then we'll be moving over to Maddie's research on hybrid working, and she'll be sharing her thoughts and information on that. And then there'll be a quick discussion between Rosie and Maddie on her research. And then we will have a Q&A session as well that Rosie and Maddie will be hosting. So any questions that you have throughout the session, please do pop them into the Q&A box, and they'll be answering those towards the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rosie to take us through the Global Institute for Women's Leadership's Flexible Working Report.
Thank you, Lucky. So I'm going to summarise some of the findings from a number of reports that we have conducted at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And you can find them all on our website. Our website is in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, and you can sign up to join our mailing list from that link as well. And the work I'm citing today has been produced by my colleagues Rose Cook, Laura Jones and Caitlin Schmidt. So first of all, their work that they've done, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, has looked at parenthood and job quality. And what they found is that mothers, particularly mothers of school-age children, are less likely than women without children to have high quality jobs. And the way they define job quality is looking at various aspects, so access to training, prospects for promotion, bonuses and pay, control over your working time, and control over your job tasks, and flexibility overall. And what they find is that mothers are more likely than women without children to have poor quality jobs, according to these measures. And mothers are much more likely than women without children to work in jobs that combine good working time quality, access to informal flexibility and control over job tasks with poor promotion and training prospects and non-wage rewards. So basically, mothers are much more likely to be in jobs where they can manage the hours that they do, but a lot of the other aspects of what makes a job good quality, you know, the fact that you feel developed and you have opportunities for promotion and you can take leadership over your own work, a lot of those aspects of the job are perhaps missing. And there are a large part of these differences between mothers and women without children can be explained by the fact that women with children are much more likely to work in part-time jobs, and part-time jobs tend to have good in terms of flexibility, but low prospects for promotion. So when we think about progression and flexible working, we need to differentiate between different forms of flexible working. Sometimes I think, especially post-COVID, we tend to default to thinking it's just remote work. But there are several aspects to flexible working. It can be location flexibility, whether you're working from home or hybrid or in the office. Schedule flexibility, you know, do you work job share? What hours do you work? Do you have control over when the work is taken? And then there can be reduced hours, so part-time work. So gender gaps in flexible working exist in that location flexibility is more common among fathers, especially since COVID. but part-time work is more widespread amongst mothers. So flexible working is in being able to, as I'm doing now, taking joining this webinar from home before I go into the office a bit later on this afternoon. That's something that's more often available than to fathers, whereas mothers tend to have less control in their part-time jobs of where they do the work. There's higher career progression for men who work flexibly, whereas women working part-time are falling behind. So jobs where you have that opportunity to decide where you're going to work and when tend to be the jobs that have higher reward and progression opportunities. Part-time jobs, that tends to be absent. And working additional hours is widespread amongst flexible workers. So those people who are able to choose to work in a hybrid format, they tend to be able to choose when they're working, but there's this flexibility paradox that actually the number of hours that are expected almost in return for that flexibility are growing. But this doesn't apply to part-time women workers, because they need, often if they're doing it because they're mothers and they need to have reduced hours, actually they cannot gain from the benefits that the additional hours are associated in terms of progression and reward. So women working part-time, mothers working part-time in particular, are falling behind in workplace cultures that expect and reward regular unpaid overtime. So parents value both job security and control, which is overlooked in policy making related to family-friendly policies. So I think, we talk a lot about flexibility as if flexibility is the panacea that's going to create gender equality in the workplace. Actually, what parents often need is also predictability. This kind of is the flexibility paradox of working ever more hours actually isn't accessible to those who have to pick up at a certain time and then spend some time with their children. Also gendered assumptions by employers. So assuming that mothers who are working part-time don't want to have training and progression, that they're just, they have sort of, that they've put their career to one side, means that often opportunities are not made available. There are still huge barriers to flexible working, employers denying requests for unsubstantiated business needs, and working cultures that actually don't really deal with those requests effectively. Line manager support is absolutely critical to make sure that flexible working works well. So, as I've said, working parents, especially mothers, sometimes and often actually sacrifice elements of job quality such as pay and regression in order to have that workplace flexibility, which allows them to stay in work. The job trade-offs have varied across industries, with some parents giving up job security in favour of flexibility, whereas others had sacrificed career progression in favour of job security. And the factors such as a partner's job and childcare costs feed into these trade-offs, as I'm sure we're all very well aware at the moment, with the huge debate about the cost of childcare in the UK. So I won't read through all these in detail, but these are our recommendations for employers. First of all jobs need to be designed and advertised as flexible. We need to improve the process for requesting flexible working, and a variety of forms of flexible working, not just location flexibility, should be made available at all levels. And we need to work towards a situation where there's greater parity between part-time and full-time workers in terms of pay and progression. And this should be managed through line managers engaging in work planning, emphasising outputs rather than hours, and talking to working parents to work out what will work for them, rather than making assumptions about people's preferences. And in terms of government, improving the guidance for employers who are dealing with flexible working requests. If they do this well, this could really help with employment opportunities to make them more fairly distributed across the country, which could increase boosting employment, but whilst maintaining job security. And of course, the issue of the high cost of childcare is absolutely fundamental to these questions. And we really think governments need to encourage businesses to report on indicators such as pay and progression among flexible and part-time workers, as well as things like gender pay gap reporting, so that we can really monitor progress. And I think I'm going to be quizzed by Maddie now.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Rosie. I've not been caught up with your flexible working, so it's quite interesting for me as well. So yeah, I guess could you just, like, if you had to identify two kind of top advantages of flexible working, what would they be?
Well, I suppose it depends which type of flexible working we're talking about. So I think many of us who are, office-based workers now have the kind of advantage that I've described today, where, I'm still at home, but I've got an event that needs me in London later on today, so I'm going in. That means that I've seen my kids this morning and been involved with them. I've had time, even though I'm at an event this evening, I've had time to do some of the administrative home tasks that actually, if I had to be in the office from 9 and wasn't going to leave again until 10 p.m. tonight, I wouldn't have had a chance to do. So that's a fantastic opportunity. That means having a full-time demanding job with some evening commitments, it can be possible to combine that with a decent family life. But unfortunately, that's not available to everyone. It's very much limited to knowledge-based workers. And I think that kind of real location flexibility, so that's a positive. Another positive about flexibility, I think, is around mental health and work-life balance. And actually, I guess I've hinted that with describing my day-to-day, that if I, as in the past, before COVID, on a day like today, I would have dropped my kids off at their breakfast club. But at that time, they're a bit older now, before COVID, for about 7:30. I'd have come in to the office, and then I'd have got home at about 11:30 tonight. And there'll be various other things that I hadn't been able to do that would be piling on the stress in my mind, guilt for not being involved with my children, but also other practical things that now I can manage. So there's a psychological benefit as well as a practical benefit, but it's not available to everyone. So, what are your thoughts about that issue, Maddie? What would you say are the two main advantages?
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm obviously similar. I've got 2 young children, so I love the fact that I can flex in my role. I guess I guess for me, I was thinking about the organisational benefits as well. So you can kind of, obviously your talent pool is larger. You can keep hold of those people who might otherwise have to kind of quit work because they can't manage everything. But I was just wondering about whether there's an issue around whether the flexible working arrangement is formal or informal. So, in academia, there's often a bit of a resistance to formalising our flexibility. But I always, academia is a bit of an oddball, really. So I was just wondering what you thought about that, or what your research showed around organisations, and what's the advice, I guess, around formalising or keeping flexible working more kind of.
I agree with you that I think often in universities there can be quite a lot of inequality between, depending on what your subject is. There's some academic departments, researchers have always had a lot of flexibility. Now, it's probably not true if you've got a lab and you've got experiments running and you need to be there to check that things are ticking over. But in a lot of academic disciplines, there are certain things that you need to be there for your teaching, for your meetings. But actually, when it comes to research and your writing, you decide where you're going to do it. And one of the things when I took on more of a leadership role, so I was working much more with professional services inside universities, was how little flexibility seemed to be available to those colleagues. And I think some of that is because it wasn't, it's not written down. And so not everybody's, we had the discussion hadn't been had. And so I actually think, in a sense of having sort of minimal expectations of what needs to be done in person, that kind of makes it clear that there are these expectations, but also then allows people to plan their time better is really important. And I certainly see that's changed massively inside universities since COVID, that there is, I think, much more equality across academics and professional services than there was. And I guess that is partly because we've formalized it. We've said, I think at King's, you need to be in the office 8 days a month, something like that, and that applies to everybody. I think that's a much fairer system. What do you think?
I'm just wondering about, I worked with a couple of organisations over summer, and they had roles like you described, so like lab-based roles, for example. And I'm just wondering if sometimes, because of flexible working, you might end up with a kind of 2-tier workforce. So the people that have to be on the front line, for example, and the people that can then afford to, or kind of are able to, like you say, the knowledge workers able to do flexible working. So how can organisations manage that kind of potential for group conflict a little bit, where you kind of got, you're allowed to work in Starbucks for, 8 hours a day, and I have to be stuck to my desk in the office. So how do you think they should manage that?
I think they should really think of your earlier point about talent, is that often there's a kind of legacy or a path dependency about the way things done. So, jobs that could be job shared or done part-time, or shifts that could change. They're just the way they are, and the staff have to fit into them. And I think, there can be examples from nursing, for example, like this, where some hospitals might have a 12-hour shift pattern. Well, on a nurse's salary, very difficult to get childcare for a 12-hour shift pattern, because obviously you've got to drop off and pick up, and most after school and before school clubs wouldn't give you that 12 hours, and a nanny's too expensive. How does it work? Why do the shifts need to be 12 hours? I mean, some employers, some healthcare employers have really changed that, so you can actually have more control over that. And with technology, I think we ought to be able to plug in the hours people need and try and come to a better compromise position. I've certainly heard similar things in science departments where people have to come in on the Saturday to do, to deal with the lab. And actually there's just a rigid pattern that suits the employer, that this is the way it is. But I would have thought with technology, it's not so difficult to actually try and sort that out in a way that works better for everybody and allows you to retain good staff.
So have you come across any fantastically innovative examples of flexible working? Because we've all kind of had the standard, I guess, part-time compressed hours. Is there anything new or different to how certain organisations are doing this?
Well, I think the thing I'm always banging on about, Maddie, which you've heard me say loads of times, is Zurich Bank now advertise all of its jobs as either full-time, part-time, flexible, as in reduced hours, or job share at every level. And it's made such a difference with 30% more women applying to senior jobs. And some of those jobs in that organisation will be face-to-face key worker jobs, and some of them will be knowledge worker jobs, but they can all be done to some extent flexibly and part-time. And that's transformational. And I think it's when we think like that, we don't default to this, whether it's 35 hours or in some industries 50 hours or whatever it is a week, is the only way to deliver for an organisation. And if you're not on that standard model, then you're almost a sort of additional worker on a different track. We need to see what people are producing and what they are contributing, and be less fixated on that kind of very static view of what a worker looks like.
Yeah. Also, that more research coming out on the 4-day week.
Yes.
I was saying that they're working really well. I'm just also wondering about.
Do you have an example you would like to bang on about?
Well, I've only got my home examples really, and the fact that my husband works flexibly, and it works really well for me. But I have to say, it's part of his organisation's culture that the men do it too, and it's really, really common. I think that's really important, so it doesn't become a women's thing. That women are flexible and men are in the office, and so his team and all the men in his team and his senior managers as well all work flexibly in some way. There's job shares at very, very senior levels. And it's just kind of part of the culture. And I think that really, really is important to try and embed it, so it doesn't become just this is for kind of low, mid-level female employees.
You're so right. And obviously that's really reinforced by the research, isn't it? That when senior men role model this kind of flexible working, that actually that's when the culture changes.
So what do you think they're kind of, I guess we sort of touched on that. There's a question in the chat around the 4-day week, I think.
Oh, I mean, it's interesting. I personally at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're always about the evidence. What evidence is there about what works? And it seems from those studies that productivity hasn't gone down, it's gone up. So it's a win-win. So I think from my point of view, that sounds fantastic. And I can imagine that people are able to come to work with more energy and more, enthusiasm for work, and perhaps are able to deliver more. So I think that it's not, I think, we're very much aware that employers, employees, they're in a relationship where it needs to make business sense for everybody. Otherwise the business won't be, or the organization won't be a success. So whatever initiatives you put into place have got to work from a business point of view. But it certainly seems from those studies that the 4-day week has been very effective in those businesses. So how exciting. What do you think?
I spoke to some of my participants in my project on hybrids, which I'll obviously speak about in a minute, about whether they would want to drop more days and hours, because it was kind of in the news at the time. And I think one of their concerns was the fact that you could work on something and then email someone who was on their day off, and then you get the delay and everything takes often a lot longer because people are away. But I spoke to people that were in that pattern and they didn't seem to have that problem, or they were saying, you know what, actually it doesn't matter that it takes an extra day, and you suddenly find that those things that you thought were really urgent aren't so much. So I think there is that concern potentially, but I think if you manage it well and people understand, or there's a kind of way of visualizing how when people are in the office and when they're not, and when they're
I mean, with the 4-day week, is it not common for everybody to do the same 4 days, or does it tend to be that that there's a kind of yes,
I think it depends on the role. So
Yeah.
and obviously the type of organisation. So I think if you're an organisation that can shut, I guess, for 1 day, then that's fine. But other organisations are staggering it. So you might have one person who's off on a Wednesday, other people off on a Thursday. So there's coverage for that role. But yeah, there is that potential for, I guess, slowing things down. If you email someone on Monday, then they get back on Wednesday.
I mean, isn't it a bit like job shares and whether you're doing them well or not? Because you know, if you're not going to be in the office on a particular day, which of course can happen to any of us at any time, that we're ill or whatever, you know, happens, that urgent things, you need to be doing it as part of a team and it needs to be handed over. So, you know, that's about the kind of planning and the job planning. And, you know, if something really genuinely is sincerely urgent, most people wouldn't mind receiving a phone call when they're not at work. It's when that becomes normalized. And as you say, all these small things become urgent. So it really should be about, you know, the transition. What are you handing over to people if that's necessary? And as you say, identifying what's really urgent and what isn't. But it doesn't seem to have been a problem for these organisations.
Yeah, no, not so far. I think it's brilliant. I can see Lucky getting edgy about my next session. So if I go on to my bit.
Sure, let me pop your slides up.
Yeah, I was going to talk about my project on hybrid, which is very closely linked to this, because obviously hybrid is a kind of very common form now of flexible working. I did this research over the summer, was it? It feels really like a long time ago, but yeah, the summer last year. And I basically wanted to know, there was lots of stuff in the press and things about hybrid working, but it was focusing on patterns of work. So when people were in the office and when they weren't, but I wanted to know more about what happens like when people hybrid work. So how are they actually interacting on screen, across chat rooms, that kind of thing. How often they're going into the work, what are they doing when they go into the office, and that kind of thing, and if there was a gender difference on all those things. So not necessarily about the pattern of work, but the actual kind of day-to-day working. So I interviewed 40 men and 40 women across a range of different organisations, had some great support from the Female Lead, which is a charity that supports women and girls, and was lucky enough to be funded by the Leverhulme Trust for this as well. And as kind of expected, I found some kind of broad rewards that are very similar to what Rosie's talked about. So in terms of people feel very trusted and respected because they can choose when and where to work. They therefore feel they can choose what is best for their own productivity. So they can choose to work from home when you've got focusing on a big report, and you can choose to go into the office when you want to be a bit more social. As Rosie was also saying around flexible working, you know, there's a great advantage for health and well-being. I would say for many people, I think there's definitely a social class element to this. You know, if you've got the funds to be able to have a huge house with a separate office and all this kind of thing, it's beneficial for your health and well-being. For not everyone, I think, but it does definitely mean that people have more time to be able to do things like, I don't know, jogging, dog walking, that kind of thing. And also cooking home meals for lunch and things was talked about quite a lot. People also talked about reduced costs and carbon footprint in terms of commuting. Obviously, I did my research in the summer, so as we've gone into winter, people might be talking more about, you know, gas bills and things like that. But generally, people were quite happy and said that they'd had reduced costs, and also in terms of time and commute. And the big one is clearly for any carers, it enables you to spend more time at home and be able to flex those differences. So these are the rewards, but I guess I was more interested in the risks, because these were very, you know, I think these are found across lots of different studies now on hybrid working. So I found 4 different risks for women in hybrid work. So the first one we kind of called women as invisible superworkers, and what we mean is that what I was noticing was that behind the digital wall, it's really difficult to be seen as an employee. So you're very, very reliant on managers to spot your productivity, spot your outputs, and champion you, because they're the people that have contact, and you've no longer got that kind of office vibe of being able to see people so much. and for people to notice more informally or casually what you're doing. And what I found is that women were very focused on performance rather than social interactions. They're really, really focused on getting things done, possibly, oh, you can go back up, it's fine, and possibly to kind of think about trying to get rid of those stereotypes around kind of domestic care. So, you know, I'm going to really show that I'm going to do lots of work so people don't think I'm spending all day putting washing on and doing childcare and things. And what it results in is women kind of toiling away and not necessarily getting noticed for that work. So that was kind of the first danger I saw. The second one was being shielded from office politics. Now, my research really focuses on office politics. So I was really interested in this because people talk about lack of water cooler moments in hybrid work. So I was expecting to find the people who worked at home more were engaging in less politics, and the people that went into the office more were engaging in more politics. But that's not really what I found, because when you go into the office within a hybrid role, most people are on Teams or Zoom. So you don't actually have much social interaction. The office is often empty. People are hot desking, so you might not sit next to people that you know regularly. So although there's this perception that you might do all your politicking within the office, it's not necessarily true. And what I found is that everyone is very siloed. So you're not working across different teams. You're only seeing the people that you work regularly with. So a lot of people are missing out on gossip or intel about the kind of informal organisation, what's going on with different teams, what's happening, not necessarily what the organisation wants you to know. It's the other stuff that's quite important. But I guess the key thing I found was that women are more likely to kind of buckle down, do the work, try not to engage in this idle chit chat stuff, whereas men actually are more likely, in terms of my research, to engage in that politics online. So they are doing more kind of secret hidden chats, more telephone calls, more pre-meetings, getting the intel, getting the gossip, and therefore they're more likely to be in the loop about what's happening in organisations and be able to leverage that for their careers. That was really, really important finding. In terms of missing meaningfulness, found that a lot of the hybrid work can be a bit demoralising. Back-to-back video calls, it can be isolating. There's a lack of camaraderie sometimes from work. It's not a very joyful experience, especially as we headed out of COVID. I think it was felt quite high pressure, particularly if you had childcare responsibilities. And I think, as I say, even when you're in the office, a lot of people on video calls, the office banter has disappeared a little bit. And I think women in particular have developed often a very transactional relationship with work as a result. So very productive, but kind of when it's done, and I'm not interested in the extra side of work so much. And I think all of these combine to be a bit risky for to kind of create a hybrid career scene potentially. So, you know, if you're not engaging in politics, you're not getting in the informal information that we know from all our organisational politics research is so important for career progression. You're not getting recognised for the work that you think you are being recognised for, because it's really difficult to champion people in hybrid work, and you're not finding a very joyful experience, then it might impact your career progression. Combined with the junior employees that I spoke to, they didn't know, but other people talked about them saying that they lack vicarious learning. So it's really difficult to pick up office skills when you're not in the office and you can't overhear how people talk to clients and things like that. And obviously more senior roles seem to require more in-person contact as well. So if people have restructured their whole lives around being quite flexible early to mid-career and then want to progress, then they're going to have to either restructure or kind of reconsider that. So organisations really need to make sure that those flexible working arrangements don't just occur at that low mid-level, but they also need to follow up to make sure that people can progress without having to change everything about their lives. So I guess overall, everyone was really, really happy with hybrid. So I don't want to be kind of bringing it down. I think it's a fantastic thing. I mean, I benefit from hybrid work myself. And all the participants said they were happy. So all 80 were very happy with hybrid working. But what I would say is there is a number of risks that organisations need to be aware of. So it's not just, like Rosie said, it's not just the panacea for women's progression. And I won't go through all of these in massive detail, but essentially there's a number of ways that, and these weren't things that I necessarily have identified, they were things that I found as best practice in my interviews. So kind of reframing what productivity is, it's not necessarily working long hours or ticking off tasks. It can be chatting with a colleague and coming up with something innovative, making sure that managers sponsor and champion their employees, making sure people have access to senior managers, so you're not always having to go through meetings with a manager to be able to be seen, helping employees separate work a little bit more, even delay sending emails, for example, coming up with kind of ways to reframe politics a bit more. It's a bit controversial. I'm very much a fan of the positive politics can be a very positive thing if you're inclusive about it. So making sure that people are networking transparently, try and get people into the office if you can to meet people, but mandating it didn't seem to work. And then doing a range of things to help people bond a little bit more. So, getting these social groups, creating an office environment that's fun, and also working with particularly people that join organisations in a hybrid fashion, making sure that is in person if possible, so you can form strong relationships from the off and really understand the networks that you need to build. So yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of my research. So I guess Rosie might roll me now. Maybe she's wandered off.
I'm still here. I've just stopped sharing so I can get my questions up to you, so I can start asking you about your fantastic research. So you've talked about you've talked about some of the risks to organisations of hybrid working. But what are the risks if they don't actually offer flexible or hybrid working, or they're not doing it very well?
Yeah, I think pretty much all my participants, who obviously were people who were in hybrid working, all said that it was something that they would all look for in future work. Even those who kind of preferred to be in the office more said they wanted the flexibility, so they didn't want that taken away from them, even though they didn't really use it so much. So some people were going into the office maybe 4 days a week, for example, and just staying at home 1 day a week, but they still said it would be something that's really important. So I think organisations that fail to accommodate flexible and hybrid working will lose out on those kind of good talent pool, essentially. So I think that's something that's really, really important. And I think it's difficult to know if organisations do it badly when you start, isn't it? But I think most organisations have kind of got the tech right now. I think one thing that organisations could definitely do more of is supporting the occupational health elements around hybrid working. I think there's a certain kind of, everyone kind of got on with it with COVID. There was maybe 1 or 2 checks that you had a desk and you were sitting properly and all that kind of thing. And then it's kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. And I spoke to people who were, flat sharing, 3 of them working hybrid, trying to, one on the dining room table, one on the sofa, one in their bedrooms, sitting really badly all day. And I think there is an assumption that the hybrid workers are middle class, live in a 4-bed house, and they can use their spare room as an office, and they've got all this space, but actually that's not true. A lot of hybrid workers are perched on the edge of a sofa, and I did find a gender element to that as well. So I often found that the women were more likely to be relegated to what I called feminine or female spaces, such as children's bedrooms, the kitchen, and men often had the big office instead. So not always. Some of them had some gender flips.
I guess the kind of economic aspects could come into that, because we know on average after heterosexual couples have children, that often the man earns more, and then then perhaps his job is given priority, so he gets the big office, and it becomes a vicious circle where actually the mother's job is always kind of relegated to be less important.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely saw that, and especially as a lot of these hybrid working relationships were started during COVID. And I think it often was mothers, because of that economic side, taking the brunt of homeschool and things, we're having to be in the same room to make sure you're keeping an eye on worksheets and filling out, I don't know, I was doing beakers of fluids and measuring them with my daughter at the same time as trying to run a team school. So I've got experience of that, and I think that's possibly why, whereas the men were able to more likely be shut off. And I think in terms of that, I did find that men reported spending more time with family, but a lot of that was about being present with family, not necessarily doing stuff for the family. So it was like, I like being in the house and I can talk to them a bit more, but the women were still more likely to be doing things like school runs and the kind of day-to-day.
And I think that pressure does come from inside the family and the economics of the family, but it also comes externally. I mean, in my experience during lockdown, being anecdotal again, my husband and I share all the childcare and everything completely equally, but the job he was in at the time put pressure on him to be always available at any time. And there was never any acknowledgement from his line manager that that he might have any additional caring responsibilities because the schools are shut. And whereas my employer, King's, was very supportive, and I was able to carve out a number of hours every day for the homeschool. And so I did it all, even though our pre-existing family relationship was one where we were economically equal and we did share everything 50-50. The assumptions of the employer that the man was available 24 hours a day created that tension where we thought, well, we can't afford for him to lose his job. We're in the middle of this pandemic. We will end up running it this way.
Yeah, I've just been looking up, I can't remember who, I can't dig out the paper, but it was looking at the fatherhood forfeit as well, in the sense of men who try and adopt flexible working and things also get quite a lot of backlash at work, you know, seen as a bit soft or too modern, and get grief for that. So I think you're right, there is an assumption that men don't do this at work. Yeah. So I think if an employer can be more supportive, it definitely helps throughout.
I definitely think that one of the things to me that is about doing it badly is about the failure to recognise the problems of the kind of always on culture that we can very easily slip into with a hybrid form of working, because people are, you know, do want to show that they're busy and they're available and be hyper responsive because you can't see them sitting there. And so you can have, there've always been these cultures, not always, but certainly in the last 30 years since women have entered the workforce, research has shown that the long hours culture really grew. I mean, I think if you think back to the sort of Mad Men and people spending a lot of their working hours actually in the bar or the pub, it's actually since women entered the workplace in greater numbers, the association between very high financial rewards and long hours became much stronger than it did before. And I think that was partly a gatekeeper thing, that only certain people in the workplace can do those very long hours. I think that culture of valorizing over work has gone into some employers around the kind of the future of work, and has even grown to be an even bigger issue. And I think that's why things like the 4-day week, which isn't necessarily particularly targeted at gender equality or women, is healthy from a number of perspectives, because in terms of mental health and actually saying we can all have moments at work when we need to really push hard to get something done, but you can't work like that all the time. And that to me is when it's done badly, is when people like to sort of tell you, oh, I've worked all weekend and that's what I always do. We think, well, why can't you get your job done? Is the job badly designed? Do you not manage your time well? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think it's really important that there is a kind of a message sent from senior leaders about what is required. I kind of do I do research on equality diversity, but I also apply it within the business school at King's. Because I'm the academic lead, so I'm trying to change things. It's pretty good. I think we've got flexible working, but trying to make sure that everything is as good as it could be in terms of our processes. And one of the things I'm trying to make sure that we highlight is just a simple thing of delaying email sends and delaying. I just found out that you can do it on Teams as well, on Teams chat. You can delay it so it doesn't arrive in the person's chat until a certain time. And I think that's really useful because I work really weird hours. I've got a 3-year-old who just wakes up all the time. So I might creep, out to work at kind of 4 o'clock in the morning and get a couple of hours before he wakes up or something. But I don't expect my colleagues to respond. That's ridiculous. And I don't want to put pressure on people. And sometimes I might work on the train home after 5, for example. And I was talking to my colleague yesterday and I said, anything that appears after 5, I'm just on the train smashing stuff out. I don't need to respond until tomorrow. And I think it's just simple things like that can really change the culture. So you're not getting emails coming in at Saturday afternoon just because someone else finds it more easy to work. So yeah, I
was really struck by that when I joined King's, that I wasn't getting emails at the weekend and the evening, and I learned there'd been a policy a couple of years before to avoid that. And I go to an exercise class at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, so it often means on a Sunday evening I send loads of emails, but I don't want my team to think that they need to respond, so I do all delay send, so it arrives on Monday morning. It's so easy. I don't know why we don't just mandate that all over the place. Well, I think this might be a good moment to draw in some questions from the chat. What do you think, Maddie?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Let me just have a look. I know we've got one about, it's all very well men role modelling. Let me just, I've got to close my document and open the Q&A. Nope, I'm in the wrong place. It's the chat, isn't it? I need to look at, yes. So we have a question here from Nicola, and she talks about me having referred to the benefit of men in senior roles modelling flexible working, i.e. doing different hours, part-time, drop off or pick up. But she says, well, actually, we still can have this norm where men doing that are seen to be a nice guy, you know, he's a modern man, and he's lauded for it, but whereas women who do the same thing are kind of perhaps seen as giving more focused on their family and giving their career less of an emphasis. I mean, do you think that's a problem? If it is, what can we do about it?
I think support from senior leadership is important and making it part of the culture. But I guess from my research, it's also my worry was that, you know, engaging the political side of work is really important. And if you've got a setup where everyone's hybrid, then you need to start engaging in those kind of more chats and informal talk. But if you've got a setup where men are going to be in the office and women are not in the office, that is almost a very clear divide in how people are networking and sharing information. And that, I don't know how to solve it necessarily, but I think that's something that organisations need to be really, really kind of aware of. And I think that is probably the most damaging aspect for women's careers, because if you're not having that kind of informal knowledge of which projects are seen as more important, for example, which job openings are coming up that haven't been advertised, all this kind of knowledge that comes quite easily when you're walking around corridors, it's suddenly you're shut away and you don't know that other people are getting it because you can't see it. And I think that's probably the biggest impact I think that will happen on people's careers.
I also think it can be about systems, because, you know, for example, thinking about Nicola's question, you know, we know if you look at kind of some CV studies where you've got exactly the same, you know, candidates, but you've called one's a man and one's a woman, that the man will be more likely to be described as having potential and, you know, let's promote him, whereas the woman, oh, she's got a bit more to do on exactly the same kind of set of criteria. And here Nicola's describing a situation where the man and women have both adopting exactly the same approach to combining work and family and being judged differently for it. And that's about having really good systems when you're evaluating someone's performance. What is it you're measuring? It shouldn't be just some feeling you have about whether this person is a great guy. It should be, well, actually, what are the metrics that we're using and what are the processes that we put in place that actually highlight bias? Because this is a bias that brings it to the surface so that we realize, actually, you know, these two candidates are both doing exactly the same thing here. Why are we judging one as a poorer performer than the other?
Yeah, well, I think it's about talking about different reasons for flexible working. So it's not always childcare. There can be just people just want a flexible life, which is lovely. But also, I think there's a responsibility as well for senior women to share that they are parents if they are, or if they have caring responsibilities, and normalise that a little bit. There's a tendency for people to try and hide that, because it can be perceived in that way that Nicola's talking about. But I think that does mean that we end up thinking that, you know, the very senior people don't have caring responsibilities, when actually they do often, and they're kind of hiding it. And I think if it's normalised, of course, men and women, this is something fine. You know, you just go home and sort your children out and it's okay. I think that's something that we should aim for, that we shouldn't try and hide it. And I'm not always a massive fan of this bring your whole self to work rhetoric. I think it works for some people great, and other people don't necessarily want to do that. But I think if you feel like you can, then it's a good option. And I think it means that the culture, it's essentially just kind of, I guess, flexibility, fluency. So people, you know, can talk about it a lot more without it being a hidden secret that you're trying to manage all this at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, so we've got a question for Naomi here, Naomi Finch. And she's saying, you know, is there a problem with sort of only having your emails 9 to 5? Doesn't that actually make things less flexible? I mean, my view, Naomi, is that there's a kind of idea of those core business hours is quite helpful in a way, particularly to parents, in that, you know, childcare is often at least available during those times. Whereas, you know, when people are sending emails in the evening, at the weekend, if you have got childcare commitments and you want to be around for your kids, if there's an expectation you reply, you often don't have an alternative. So you might be grabbing an hour or two, but if you start to get to the point where you feel, my boss always thinks things on a Saturday afternoon, and by the time I've looked at it, 5 and 6 people have responded, you've never got the chance to kind of show your commitment in that way. So I personally think that having these core hours is quite helpful, but that, we then all have the freedom to sort of move around them. But I mean, what do you think, Maddie?
I think most workplaces have these core hours, and I think it's a really useful thing. And I think it takes the pressure off you thinking other people are working. And I think that's a stressful thought, because it means you're thinking, oh my goodness, should I be working as well? And it's just difficult to see that. But what I would say is it really depends on the work. So I spoke to, in my research, people who were, for example, computer coders working within quite a technical role. They just happen to prefer working very late at night. So starting kind of 11, and they didn't have much client external contact. They didn't necessarily have, core hours in the same sense as the rest of the organization. So their specific team would like to work kind of till 3 o'clock in the morning or something. They all were fine with that. And I think sometimes
I worry about that, Maddie, though, because say you were in that team and you'd loved it and that's how you'd worked. I mean, I have to say, when I was a PhD student, that is how I lived. But once I had kids, I realized, they have a circadian rhythm. They need things at certain times of the day. And if your team was kind of routinely up till 3 in the morning, and actually you haven't got childcare at that time, you're feeding your baby, or you need to sleep because they're going to be up at 5 or 6. You can't stay in bed till 11. Suddenly that job becomes completely inaccessible to you. Whereas if they got on with their coding between work hours, that's when it was shared, and then anything they did outside of those hours kind of only became visible at a certain time. Wouldn't it make it easier for people to do that job?
Yeah, I know, I see what you mean, but I guess my point was it kind of comes down to the manager of the team to be on the alert for that. So if you've got someone who needs that flexibility, if you've got the whole team who are very happy to work at these hours, then I think that's fine. But if you've got someone who then comes in and say, well, actually we have to adjust this and
I just worry about it, because I think we do get these industries that are very male dominated and others that are less so. And tech, IT has become
very male dominated.
And you can imagine, perhaps you'd be working in that team, you wouldn't even say it out loud. You'd think, well, I can't, once I have kids, I can't do this. It's not possible. I'm going to be exhausted.
I would say it was very junior employees who were doing that. So I think they probably were still in the kind of university mode of this is how we work. But I can see how, for some people, they might want that connection, but perhaps it comes down to kind of individual or kind of very small group discussions about how to do that. I think generally you're right in the terms of the core hours thing works better. I think it becomes a little bit more muddied when you've got on the chat functions and things. So email, yes, and maybe Teams, but things about Slack, which is kind of very real time. That is more difficult to manage, I think, in terms of if you're working on projects at different times. But ultimately, I think it becomes down to kind of management reining people in. So when you have your morning meeting or something, everyone is on the same page again, something like that. But I think there is scope for some flexibility within flexible working to do this. But I agree with you that I think in terms of inclusivity, particularly around childcare, then those core hours, they're quite important.
Maybe it's come back again, but I want to say, Naomi, I'm not saying core hours of when you need to do your work. I think that lots of us have flexibility around when we send our emails and when we do our work. It's just that some workplaces can come a place where you are always supposed to be available, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Tuesday night. So it's fine to be doing your work then, but you don't want to prompt other people that they have to be. And I think that's the issue that we're describing here, that having hours in which you're communicating with others can be really helpful, because it creates some boundaries around when you're working, when you're not working. The others, you can choose to adopt them or not, but it does actually provide some space in the day where you can opt out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely like that. So I work very strange hours some days, work some weekends, but I wouldn't expect my colleagues to. So I think it's just signalling that, I don't expect that.
I have to say, I mean, I when my kids were little, I used to work till midnight quite regularly, but it's on the days that you're not, you'd probably prefer, if you work to midnight one day, the next day you're actually going to, because I would put them to bed, sort them out, put them to bed, and then I'd catch up with my work. But say the next day I'm not working, I would much prefer that I was then able to have an evening than think that actually all these emails are coming through and actually I now need to carry on responding to them. So I personally think that makes sense, and there does seem to be evidence to suggest having some kind of control over email culture is helpful in the workplace. Have we got any more questions? We'd love to have some more. I think there's one more. Any more questions from anybody in the chat section, or? Because I can see we've got loads of you in the audience. We'd love to hear from you.
Maybe we should give everyone a couple more minutes. I can take everyone through the gender program, and then maybe that will give people a bit of time to have a think before we end.
Lucky's just getting her slides up.
Yes. Okay, so I know most people in the audience know that we have a fantastic Building Gender Inclusive Workplaces program that Maddie and Rosie both direct on that program and teach. So if this conversation has got you thinking and really interested, then do take a look at the course content. So this program is a hybrid program, so you can take it in person or virtually, and it takes place across 9 months. And really the program's focused on making a real impact and a difference within your organization, and kind of picking up a problem or taking a challenge within your organization and actually doing something within your organization to build kind of a more inclusive workplace. The core course content is focused on kind of creating a business case for gender equality within your organization, and Maddie and Rosie will help you to articulate that. And then kind of really looking at redesigning actual processes and practices within your organization, and are kind of moving away from placing the emphasis on changing women, actually changing the processes and practices within your organization to make sure that we're creating really sustained change. And then also looking at strategies for cultural transformation, how do you deal with the politics around this, and then also looking at leadership for inclusive workplaces. So how can you be an inclusive leader, and how can you create inclusive leaders around you within your teams? And you can see the course dates. So the program starts on the 4th of May, and there are five course dates, and then there'll also be some distance learning in between that as well. So any questions or any further information you need, please do let us know. I shall pop in our email address in the chat now, and we can have a conversation one-on-one if you'd like to learn more. Do you have any more questions, Rosie?
A couple more have come through. So we've got 2 questions. We've got one from Rebecca. I'm co-chair of an internal network of women in consultancy, and we promote the learning, development, equality and empowerment of women in our organisation. We do struggle with some of the difficulties you've described. What can we do as a network to tackle some of these challenges? What do you think, Maddie?
I think lobbying for kind of a clear, flexible working policy, if you've not got one, is a first step. Making sure there is a policy, because often surprisingly there isn't a policy. And like you say, advertising, trying to make this kind of normalized. So talking about flexibility more, making sure it's not just a women's issue, talking about men taking more flexibility, encouraging flexible working within your appraisal structures, and also when you advertise job adverts. So in the course we very much talk about processes. So we kind of moving away from talking about unconscious bias training and things like that, to saying actually let's look at processes like appraisals, selection, promotion panels, those kind of things, and how flexibility is treated within those. Does your promotion, for example, require the same kind of number of outputs, for example, for your part-time workers as your full-time workers? And if it does, then it means that part-time workers have to wait twice as long to get promoted and things like that. So it's thinking about those, how things are assessed, I think, within the processes is really important when it comes to embedding flexible working.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. And then we've got a question from Nicola. Do you find organisations in different sectors are more or less receptive to this programme? You've already mentioned IT as being quite male dominated.
this program.
Yeah.
I think it's just more important for those organisations, basically.
Yeah.
I think yeah, that's my experience. I think in terms of receptive, I think often those organisations are the most keen because they know there's a problem. Is my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you can find, you can find sectors where, the issues are quite obvious. To me, that the culture of normally working till 3 a.m. as a collective team is just, you could walk in there and you could quite quickly think about, well, what could we do to try and make, to try and bring a more diverse group into this team, perhaps. But sometimes you can get involved with an organisation that has all the most fantastic policies on paper, and yet it doesn't seem to be translating. There's still perhaps a massive gender pay gap and an ethnicity pay gap. And why is that when the policies look so good? And it's very often about the culture, that actually what is rewarded in reality. And as you were talking about, Maddie, is the kind of informal politics of you'll never get promoted unless you actually do X and Y, which is not written anywhere. Is that getting in the way of progression? So I think, yes, there are obvious sectors that are very male dominated where, as you say, there can be enthusiasm, or there can be just, this is totally irrelevant. But sometimes we find there's a real need in organisations you might not expect as well. What would you say, Maddie?
Yeah, I think it's just this bringing this culture issue is really important. I think I was thinking about these sort of examples of this team that I was talking to that were working very late, and I think actually because there is flexibility there, and you've got kind of they want flexibility, so I think it's quite actually an easy fix on that in that sense. But I think it's about getting people on board and making sure it's not something that's a top-down initiative necessarily. You really have to make sure that it's so in the program we talk about how to embed change and looking at change theories, because going back to those non-gender theories is really important about how to get people on board, not just senior management but everyone, to make sure it's a cultural thing is just so important, I think.
Maybe going back to your example, that team might think they're performing really, really well. And they say, well, actually, we've got this new colleague who would like to join you, who really can't be working till 3 a.m. So we need to change things so that actually there are some core business hours when we communicate with each other. And then, of course, you can be flexible and do your coding, but we don't want you to be emailing after that time. And you can imagine that team being quite resistant. We're working really well. We're productive. What are the benefits? And that's where we need to come in and say, well, actually, the benefits of a diverse team are, and that's where, because there are some trade-offs, perhaps you do have to change what might feel like for those people in it, a very productive and close working culture, but it's an inaccessible one to people from different backgrounds or with different sort of life needs. How do you make the case? And that's something we really talk about. What is the business case for having that diversity and having that inclusive culture? And we really think there is research showing it does matter in terms of your outputs, in terms of how you understand your customers or your clients or those you're providing services for. If you've got a very homogeneous group who are gelling really well and perhaps being quite profitable, they could be more successful if they were more diverse. That's my little pitch.
There's one more in the chat about how we can make. I've got time, like 1 more minute.
We've got 1 minute. We've got 2 minutes.
Basically, how to make to stop stigmatizing parenthood within, particularly for working mothers.
Yeah, the thing is, I think there are 2 aspects to that. One of them is that the overwhelming majority of people become parents at some time in their life. So it's because we think of this as something that mothers do and mothers should do privately at home, that it's stigmatized. And so everything Maddie said about actually being public about our family lives is important, especially among senior leaders, and realizing that we whole humans are connected to each other. We don't just pop into the workplace without others needing things from us. But then on the other side, there are lots of people who don't have children who also benefit from a healthy balance between work and their own mental and physical health and all the other things that they need to do in their life. So just not making flexibility just about parents is also really key. What would you say, Maddie?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that we don't over kind of just make it a mother's issue. So flexibility in general, like making sure that you can go bowling, or you can do an exec ed course in your spare time, for example. But yeah, no, I think there is also a responsibility to just talk about it more at work. I think everyone's really bored of listening. hearing about my kids, but everyone does hear about my kids, because as head of BDI, I would think it's important to just normalise it and talk about it a bit more, and say that I didn't get any sleep because my son went to sleep. So.
You perform well on it, Maddie.
Yeah, lots of coffee.
Great. Thank you so much, Maddie and Rosie. I think that's our time for today. But it was been a really interesting and insightful discussion, and I'm really glad that everyone else has gotten involved as well through the chat and the Q&A. It's great to hear your thoughts and your questions. As mentioned, please do get in touch if you have any further questions or would like to know anything else about Jewel or about our program, so the Building Gender Inclusive Workplaces program. And I'm happy to have a one-to-one consultation with you and a conversation about kind of what we're doing here and also the course. So yeah, please do get in touch. But thank you again, Maddie and Rosie. It's been fantastic being here and having this chat with you.
Thank you very much for organising it. Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thanks for joining. Take care. Bye.